Hey, everybody. Thanks so much for being here. I'm Tom Webster, partner at Sounds Profitable and author of the music you just heard, which I call Congenial Corporate Number Three. And that's the 15-second loop version of Congenial Corporate Number Three. We're going to look at some very fascinating data today about the true crime podcast consumer. And we're going to do so with a couple of special guests. We have Melissa and Mandy from Moms and Mysteries. And I'm going to go through the data about the true crime listener, what makes them different, what makes them special, why they're still alive. And then we're going to come back and we're going to talk to Melissa and Mandy about their experiences with their own very successful podcast, Moms and Mysteries. And I can't wait to do that. But first, we need to look at some data because that's kind of what we do here. And this is a project from our last significant survey, which was the podcast landscape. And this is a slice of that where we looked at the actual listeners or watchers in some cases, right? It's podcast consumers now of podcasts. But before we get started with the data, just real quick, Melissa, Mandy, tell us about your show a little bit for those who haven't heard of it, but I'm sure a lot of the people watching this have.
Thanks, Tom, for having us. We're so excited to be here and really appreciative. Our podcast, Moms and Mysteries, came about in 2017. We've been doing it now for almost 8 years, which is wild. And we share stories from the true crime world. We're now working a lot with families, trying to help with missing persons cases and unsolved cases. People seem to gravitate towards us, at least at the beginning, because we are two moms just working from our house, hoping at this second my son doesn't run in here or Mandy's dogs run out. So we're kind of on the fly going with it, but we're doing our best and people seem to enjoy it.
Awesome. It's funny, the social justice and solving crimes part of it is something I've heard from. I did a panel at South by last year with John Allen, Mr. Ballin, and Kylie Lowe from Dark Down East, and they both mentioned that the kind of bringing people to justice and actually spurring investigations aspect of true crime, which I found really, really fascinating. So, but we're going to come back. We're going to talk about your show, your experiences, and how you make a living.
Sure.
As after we meet the audience. But let's meet the audience first. And to do that, we're going to go to the slides here for the true crime podcast consumer, which I'm very pleased to present on behalf of Sounds Profitable with our partners and friends at Libsyn. So this, as I mentioned, came from a larger report, the podcast landscape, which we first published in the towards the end of the summer of this year. And it was sponsored in total by Wondery, BetterHelp, NPR, ESPN Podcasts, Libsyn, of course, American Public Media, Paramount, and SXM Media. This was a very large study. Many of you may have seen this before when I talk about the methodology for this study, but it was a survey of 5,071 Americans ages 18 plus. It's the largest public study of podcasting in America. And it was projected to be representative of the U.S. population. So all of these numbers essentially apply to Americans 18 plus. And I'm going to start with the genres of podcasting. And these are the people that tell us they listened to a podcast in the last month, and if they have consumed a podcast in these genres in the last 30 days. Now, this is with the total population. Comedy is number one at 35%, but true crime, our subject for today, is in the top five at 29%, effectively tied with political talk and sports statistically. So it's a top five genre. We know it's popular, but why is it popular and with whom? That's what we're going to dive into. And by the way, that 29% in terms of podcast consumers equates to 16% of Americans 18 plus who have consumed a true crime podcast in the last month. Wow. That's about 42 million persons, I believe, unmurdered. So we have that going for us. So who are they? And this is where things start to get really fascinating. And I'm going to talk about the differences with the true crime audience, not just to the American population in general, but also other podcast consumers, because there are some really interesting differences here. First of all, when you look at the age breakout of true crime podcast consumers, and these are people that have consumed a true crime podcast, either audio or video, at least one in the last month, they are significantly younger than the US population, right? If you look at that 55 plus slice, 39% of the US population is 55 or older. For true crime podcast consumers, that's 22%. And where you see the most significant bulge here is 18 to 34, which is even on the young end for podcasting in general. So it does pull a young audience. It also significantly pulls a 35 to 54 audience. So it absolutely profiles a bit young, certainly younger than the population. But here's the really fascinating part. It is certainly more heavily female than the US population. Right? The US population is roughly 50-50, 49% men, 51% women. With true crime podcast consumers, however, that's 56% women and 43% men. And not only does that lean more heavily female compared to the US population, it leans more heavily female compared to regular podcast consumers. If you're a weekly podcast consumer, that profile it's about 60-40 male. So to go from 60-40 male with weekly podcast consumers to 56-43% with true crime podcast consumers, that is a very significant swing. And as such, you might expect that true crime does well with women, and you'd be right. It is, in fact, the number one genre of podcasts consumption amongst women overall. 37% of monthly podcast listeners who are women have listened to a true crime or watched a true crime podcast in the last month. That's more than comedy, news, celebrity interviews, self-improvement, and so on. So we know it's a top 5 category, but it's also the best way to reach women with podcasting. Another thing that we learned about the true crime podcast consumers, they're a bit more diverse than the population. And I'm just showing you here a breakdown of white, Black, African American, Hispanic, Latino, and Asian American. And where you see the real differences here, it's a 2 percentage point increase with Black listeners for true crime and a 4 percentage point increase with Hispanic, Latino. So in terms of drawing a multicultural audience, a diverse audience, true crime punches above its weight. I shouldn't use violent terms today. I shouldn't say punches above its weight. I'll come up with something better than that. But
you're doing great. Yeah,
it does well. Thank you. I needed that. We all need that sometimes. Anyway, true crime consumers, more diverse than the population. And when you look at education level, they really map to exactly the population. And the reason why I'm showing you this, and if you look at, at least some college, it's almost the same, 2-year degree, 4-year degree. These are statistically almost the same as the population. I show you that because it's showing you that this is a mainstream audience. These are mainstream Americans that are right in the middle of the bell curve in terms of what they're watching, what they're listening to. But when they are watching or listening to a podcast, as we have seen in a lot of the other research that we have put out from Sounds Profitable, you're getting their full attention, right? They are giving their undivided attention to the podcast that they are consuming. But they are a mainstream audience. If you see the educational attainment being almost identical to the US population, that should tell you that income is as well, because all of these things are generally a trailing variable of education. 32% have a household income greater than 75K. So they are mainstream Americans. They're mainstream humans. They are very likely to be women. They are younger than the population. And this is what they are consuming. They're spending more time with YouTube, yes, with podcasts, we would hope, with free streaming TV, with free streaming music, and with Instagram. That's what they're telling us they are spending more time with. What are they spending less time with? Facebook. And that doesn't surprise me, given how young this group is, right? Facebook is absolutely, it's where mom and dad are. It's where I am.
Oh, I wasn't going to say that. I wasn't going to ask about your Facebook lifestyle, but
I appreciate
now that we're here.
Yeah. I check it every day before I go out and check the crops in the north. But they're spending less time with Facebook. Again, I think that's a function of age. They're spending less time with AM/FM broadcast radio. And then Instagram, that's not a huge number, but I think, video is taking a lot of time, and a lot of that is going to YouTube and I'm sure TikTok with the folks that consume your show.
Yeah.
So let's talk about podcast consumption. We know that they're younger. We know that they're more likely to be women. How much do they listen to or watch podcasts? Well, they're overwhelmingly weekly podcast consumers. About 3/4 of them say that they have consumed a podcast in the last week, with a quarter saying in the last 30 days. So we know that they are regular. I won't use the word addicted, but they certainly have their favorite shows. They have their favorite true crime podcasts, and they rely on them. They rely on them week after week. We also know that they listen to or watch a little bit more content than other podcast consumers in general. The average for a weekly podcast consumer is 6 hours a week, but with true crime, it's 7 hours a week. So they are spending an extra hour with podcast content. And that certainly increases the amount of time that they're spending with true crime. It increases the amount of time that they're spending with the medium in general. So we've got their attention, right? We've got their attention. So why do they consume podcasts? I found this graph to be super fascinating because it looks a bit different than it does for podcasting in general. The top answer, listen to discussions on topics of interest. That's generally the top answer. But look at the next 5. Something to listen to in the car or while traveling, something to listen to while walking or exercising, something to accompany household chores, audio to keep me company, and voices in conversation to keep me company when I'm alone. That's all about companionship, right?
It really is.
Yeah, no, go ahead. Go ahead, Melissa.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I fully understand this as well because I'm a big podcast listener, always have been. And I don't like silence, which is probably something I should look into. So I like to always listen to something. I like to learn something. And the story format, a lot of times with true crime, I can understand. And we hear this from especially moms, I would say, I'm just doing my chores and you're in one of my ear. I'm doing my laundry, I'm feeding my baby, all these things where it's just nice to have another person there. And it's great that people find comfort in that.
The other, I think, really interesting thing about this, about companionship and being a companion medium, is that means that podcasts and true crime podcasts are going with these consumers in places where there may not normally be consuming media, right?
Yeah.
You can't watch a video while you're driving a car, certainly, or at least you shouldn't. I mean, I do. Right?
You don't see these things on recordings.
I should not. No, I'm already on probation somewhere. But while you're doing your household chores, you're moving from room to room. Again, while you're alone, and not always alone. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But it is a true companion medium, and I think not every medium can say that, and it is particularly true of true crime. Now, true crime is not the only thing that these consumers pay attention to. These are the other genres, and they're fairly similar to what we saw in the top list in general. If you are a true crime podcast consumer, your other genres are comedy, sports, news, history, and political talk. So they don't look a ton different. They just really love true crime.
Yeah.
And otherwise, again, they look very much like mainstream Americans. I found this super fascinating because of how different the true crime podcast consumer looks from other podcast consumers. We asked questions about 3 different types of podcasts that are fairly typical. One that publishes a new episode regularly on a schedule, one that releases episodes occasionally, but not on a fixed schedule, and then limited series podcasts with a fixed number of episodes. And the reason why I wanted to call this out is the one on the right. Some podcasters are I think hitting a little friction or some headwinds doing short run narrative series. And that's not necessarily the case for true crime, right? Because these listeners love that. I mean, there's so many fixed series, limited series in true crime. These listeners and viewers are particularly attuned to it.
No, absolutely. There's something really incredible about listening to a story. We tell you hour-long stories basically, but even listening to our episodes and then going to find like a bingeable thing that's out there, I love that. I live for that. So I'm, as soon as I hear about it, I subscribe. I might not listen to them every week. I kind of hold up a little catalog for myself, and then it's a little treat when I'm doing my chores and stuff. But the other statistic I thought was very interesting on this is, and I think it helped us, Mandy, I think you would agree. Um, we've always published on Tuesdays at 12 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. You will always find our episode there. Come hurricane, come anything, we will have an episode out. So people have always been able to depend on us. And I think that's something that we benefited from early on, is knowing that people want to hear from you and want to know they can hear from you and schedule sometimes their events around listening. And so if you're kind of a fly by night, you're just not going to see that kind of engagement or really increasing your audience if they never know when you're going to be there. So I thought that was very interesting, percentage wise.
So I have a question for you. Given the clear importance of consistency, of publishing like an atomic clock regularly, as you do, are you going to run out of crime?
Unfortunately for everyone here on planet Earth, I don't think we will ever run out of crime. It would be great if we did. We'd have to adjust, but it's 2024. We will not run out. I can't believe we haven't, but we won't.
I guess I'm reassured or not reassured by that. I'll have to process that.
Yeah, think about it
offline.
later.
I'm going to think about that later. But for the benefit of the true crime podcast industry, I'm delighted that we still have crime. A couple of things here I wanted to highlight from this study, and then I want to throw in a couple of greatest hits from a study that we did previously. First of all, the true crime podcast consumer is extremely likely to give a shot to a podcast that's about a favorite brand or product. And I think if you think about this particular audience, right, as an audience that also watches a lot of TikTok, watches a lot of YouTube, is receptive to influencers, talking about brands and products, and they all have brands and products in various categories that they're very passionate about. This does not actually surprise me, though it is markedly higher than what we normally see.
Will you break this one down a little for me? They're consuming a podcast about their favorite brand or product. So
Yep.
What could you give me an example of that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in a lot of cases here, what we are talking about is a branded podcast,
Okay.
and that branded podcast could be about a brand that people are passionate about, or it could simply be presented by a brand that people are passionate about. And I'll give you just two quick examples of that. On the sort of overt brand side, there is the Trader Joe's podcast is one that certainly gets a lot of press because Trader Joe's represents a great mystery to many Americans.
Their parking lot is
What's
something
going
to be
on?
studied for. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is. I mean, we will be, aliens will study Trader Joe's. I'm surprised it's not inscribed on the Voyager spacecraft hurtling past Pluto right now. Something about, so that's sort of over because I think Trader Joe's has a lot of stories and people have a lot of questions. Another example that I would give, though, is one that I worked on, at least on the effectiveness measurement of, was a podcast that was designed to encourage girls to go into science, technology, STEM. And it was brought to you by Ford. There weren't ads for Fords in it because the girls that they wanted to listen to this were probably not going to buy a new Ford. But they did want to change or at least affect how people thought about Ford as being pro girl, right? As being trying to get more girls and women into engineering. So, that's really kind of what we're talking about here.
Got it. That makes a lot of sense.
Mm-hmm. This is one of my favorites, and I think I have an explanation for this. That's pretty good. But we asked people, does a company's involvement make you more or less likely to try a new podcast? And again, this is amongst true crime podcast consumers. 46% said more likely compared to 5% who said less likely. And to me, that tells me that, these are consumers, again, many young women who are very receptive to the right message about the right product. And they see the involvement of a company as potentially a mark of quality, right?
Yeah, absolutely. We've seen with well, Crime Junkie is a huge one now, a huge podcast and brand. And you see how quickly people will navigate or gravitate towards anything new that they put out because they know they can trust the brand, they can trust the people that are running it. And so, I mean, I feel like we're all the same. If a Dateline podcast pops up, I'm going to go download it because I know I can expect the best quality from them.
Absolutely. So I wanted to throw in a couple of greatest hits here. These were not from this particular study, but they were from a study that we did back when I first started with Sounds Profitable. And this is all the way back in, I want to say it was 2022. So it was 2 years ago.
Yeesh.
My goodness. It's a long time. It was so long ago that we didn't have the right branding yet. But I do want to show these two slides because they are particular to true crime. And this one, we asked true crime listeners specifically, do you like it when a brand supports your favorite true crime podcast? And I'll point out two things. First of all, 55% agree with that, with a third saying they strongly agree. That's passion.
Yeah.
And that's passion about something that people are not necessarily crazy about, right? Advertising.
Yeah.
And then the disagreement here is almost non-existent compared to the agreement. It's very, very low. Only 3% strongly disagree. So listeners and viewers like it when a brand supports their favorite true crime podcast. And more than that, it's memorable to them. Are you more likely to remember a brand if it advertises on your favorite true crime podcast? Again, much higher agreement here, strongly agree and agree, and very, very low disagreement. Only 4% say they strongly disagree. So it's memorable.
Yeah, I would agree. I think we've talked about this offline, Mandy and I, before. There's something about having a research-backed podcast and spending so much time on research and looking through things that people do find an honesty aspect to that we're doing our research. So if we're telling you about a brand, it's something that we've looked into, that we support, they support us, and that feels like a very special connection to have with your listeners, that with them being able to trust us because of how we present our show, that they're able to trust us in what we're recommending.
And not only that, but we also have had listeners that have written to us or wrote to us when they've heard a specific ad on the podcast and have said, I'm so happy to hear that you're working with, this sponsor, or I'm so glad that you guys are working with this company. So I do think, like Melissa was saying, that it kind of speaks a lot to the trust that the listener puts in, not only to you as a podcaster, but also into the brands, and then kind of seeing when these two worlds combined, it does seem to make the listener very happy.
Yeah.
I hadn't really thought about the research connection in that way, that so many true crime podcasts are known for being heavily researched. And that gives an ethos, I guess, to when you talk about brands and products. And it's a point I hadn't thought about, and an excellent one.
Wow, good.
So I'm going to end the data segment of this extravaganza with a look at podcast discovery and also evangelism, because that's another interesting thing, I think, about the true crime consumer. So when you ask true crime podcast consumers, besides personal recommendations, how do you find your podcast? YouTube is number one. And we put out a report just a few weeks ago that showed even people who are predominantly audio consumers also list YouTube as number one. And I'm just curious how YouTube has played a role in what you both do.
Mandy, do you want to take that?
I just would like to say that out of, I think, all the data from this report and everything, this was the single most shocking piece of information that I learned from all this data. Because to be completely honest, you won't really find a big presence of Moms and Mysteries on YouTube. We have never really ventured super far into YouTube. We've kind of dabbled in it, or we've tried to, but have not seen. We are just not very well versed with using YouTube. So that does not help us at all. But we just have never really done that, and didn't realize that we were missing out on potentially such a larger audience that is on YouTube looking for content, and we're not there. So this data definitely is extremely helpful to us as podcasters. And even since we have come to learn about this, we have been in more talks about what can we do with YouTube, because clearly that's where the listeners are. But yeah, this was actually very surprising to me. I did not expect that the majority of people were listening to podcasts on YouTube.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we've discovered in a lot of the research that we've been doing in this series with Sounds Profitable and with Libsyn sponsorship has been that YouTube is such a discovery engine, even if the show is not actually consumed on YouTube. I think what we're learning is that it may or may not be a place for your podcast, but it's a good place for the podcaster in some form because people search a lot on YouTube.
Yeah.
And that I think is really what we're coming down to. So in terms of evangelism and recommendations, these numbers are really, really high. Do people in your social circle ever recommend podcasts to you? 71% say yes. 71% of true crime consumers say yes. And 74% of true crime consumers say that they, in turn, recommend podcasts to other people. And these are all absolutely higher than average, higher than the norm for podcast consumers. So that tell a friend aspect is really clear. Is that something that you've seen?
Absolutely. We have a Facebook group that we're not as active in at the moment, but it's always filled with, I'm listening to moms, but what else is there? What else is there? And I like this true crime. I like this setup. And people are very quick to share that. I'm very quick to ask friends, I'm listening to this and this. What do you have true crime wise? And people are very excited to share this, thing that they've found that's special to them. So to me, it makes a lot of sense that true crime listeners seem to be very evangelical about sharing who they love, who they listen to with others.
Well, it turns out that people take these recommendations because when we ask true crime podcast consumers, how likely are you to try a podcast recommended by someone in your social circle? 86% say that they are. I think they have good friends.
Yeah, those other 14% losers.
I think if we look at our lives, 14% of the people we know, they're just jerks.
Yeah, I wouldn't listen to them anyway.
I think a number might be higher, actually. So I think true crime podcast consumers may just be more discerning with their social choices, right? So why would they do that? Why would you check out a podcast recommended by someone? I like to learn new things. This is a curious group. And I think we see that in not in their evangelism, but I think we also see that in their receptivity to podcasts by and about brands and products. They're not turning their brains off.
Very true. Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree with that. It's something that brought me into listening to true crime. And I've listened when I first started, really before we started our show, and I could listen to a lot of true crime. I would listen to an episode of somebody's case on Generation Y. And then I would go look and see if there was anybody else that covered the same case to see if I could learn new details. So there's something with being able to learn something new, even if it's not like learn a new skill, anything like that. It's just having this information in your brain and expanding it.
And one of the things that we learned in that previous study that I showed those older slides for is the things that people want to learn about when they're specifically listening to true crime. They're fascinated by police procedures.
Yeah.
They're right. It's not that they want to learn new ways to commit crimes.
I hope not. Yeah.
Yeah. So I don't think you're teaching people. I don't think you're teaching America how to skate and get by with illegal activities.
That's like number one on our list of things we're trying not to do every week.
It's commendable.
Thank you.
It's commendable. Now, and we talked a little bit about sharing and evangelism. This I found to be also really, really fascinating. How often do you listen to podcasts with other people co-listening, right? Yeah. And we typically think of podcasts as between the earbuds, as a very solo, private activity. But these numbers for true crime podcast consumers are quite a bit higher than non-true crime podcast consumers. So not only are they telling other friends, sometimes they're listening with other friends.
I was actually surprised at first when I saw this until I thought of all the emails we get from listeners who say, my husband and I just took a road trip and we listened to you guys all the way across the country, which I just want to say, turn off, like do something else. You don't need to hear our voices that long. I'm worried about you. But then also because our show is clean, minus murder, parents feel okay listening with their kids. So I just had somebody yesterday, I emailed back a mom that was saying, thanks for making a clean show I can listen to with my 13 and 11-year-old. So there are people in those kind of circumstances, I feel, that do listen with others. For me, listening is very personal and something I do on activities when I'm by myself. So it doesn't necessarily relate to me as much, but I understand why people do have that connection to it.
So let's wrap this up and then let's have a chat.
Let's.
So what did we learn? So true crime is the #1 podcast genre with women in America, and it's top 5 overall. So we know it is, with podcasting, it's the best way to reach women. The true crime audience is very diverse, and it over-indexes with both Hispanic, Latino, and Black audiences, and it leans younger too, younger even than the podcast consumer audience in general. True crime audiences primarily come to podcasting as a companion medium, one that accompanies them on a wide variety of activities where they may not necessarily be able to consume other types of media, and where podcasting has their full attention. The true crime podcast consumer is an evangelist for the medium. They're more likely to recommend podcasts and also more likely to consume them with other people. And then finally, people who come to consume true crime podcasts are very receptive to brands, more so than the typical consumer, both as advertisers and as producers of podcast content, whatever that involvement with the brand is. So as we end the data part of this, I'll just wrap this up here and close out of this slide. I wanted to talk to you a little bit about who you are, why do you do what you do, how you came to do what you do. Before I get into that, though, I want to first remind people that, or not remind because I haven't said it yet, I will say for the first time, these slides will be available at the top of the hour. So don't look for them until the top of the hour because I need to fix a typo that I saw. Let's be real here. I saw a typo. I'm going to fix that. It'll be available at the top of the hour. We don't tolerate imperfection here. It sounds profitable. We punish it.
Oof.
So let's get back to Melissa and Mandy and your show, Moms and Mysteries. So you seem like nice women. Why crime? What led you both to crime?
I personally think that if you grew up in the 80s, 90s, or anything, there's a comedian I love, Nate Bargatze, and he has a whole bit on how if you grew up in the 80s, it wasn't a matter of if you'd be kidnapped, it's a matter of when you'd be kidnapped. So we had this elevated sense of like Rescue 911 and Unsolved Mysteries, all of that stuff. So it was always kind of in our brains. So for me, my dad, he loved watching Cops on Saturday. He watched America's Most Wanted after that. That was like our normal evenings. So I've just always kind of gravitated towards the storytelling, towards the stories, and they're real life stories. I'm not somebody that's big into fantasy literature, anything like that. So for me, I can connect having a real person, having this real story that's happened.
It's kind of interesting for me because it's almost a little bit the opposite of Melissa. I feel like my whole life, I've just been somebody who was always really interested, even from a little girl. I always liked things that were spooky and scary movies. I always wanted to be creeped out and hear like a really insane story. And as I got older and started realizing, these fantasy stories, these made up stories that are, horrific and scary, usually are based a lot of times in something that actually happened or in something that could happen. And that's what makes it so scary, is this idea that it could happen. So as I got older, I started becoming more interested in real life stories that were scary and learning about, the people who commit these types of crimes and what makes them tick and how can people take measures to keep themselves safe so that things like that don't happen to them. But yeah, so for me, it was kind of it started more as just somebody who likes scary stuff and liked being scared. And I can't say that I still like being scared now, now that I know everything that I know from doing what we do in true crime. I think I've been scared enough for the rest of my life.
I mentioned while I was going through the data slides, the point you made about research, which I thought was really, really fantastic point. And I know that you also have a researcher.
Yeah.
What is the role of research, and how difficult is it to do the show? How much work goes into the show?
Our researcher, Haley Gray, is amazing. She is everyone's number one pick. We just got really lucky that she somehow decided to work with us, and now she's stuck. Mandy, you could probably answer more on the research side of things, but once we hired her, it really elevated our show to another level. And I think it just wasn't these two dummies talking on a podcast. It's these two dummies researched, who have read research and are better, informed in being able to share stories. So it's been huge for us. I don't know, Mandy, Mandy takes over the other side of this. Yeah.
The research aspect is extremely time consuming, and being able to have the opportunity to be at a point where we can have a researcher for the podcast has honestly made a world of difference, just because it has freed up the time that I have to do other things, to help Melissa with, or vice versa. We kind of both have just having that third person kind of working behind the scenes. And Haley does so much more for us than just research. She really is like an assistant to us and helps us out in like so many ways, any way that you could possibly think of. But before we had her, I was doing the research for every episode and writing them. And it was just honestly taking up a lot of my time. Melissa and I are both moms. We both have kids who are still in, grade school. And so that is the most important thing really in my life. So being able to have the researcher has been great. It is very, very time consuming. And I love to write. I love to read. I love to read research that's been put together. And I love to write the story in my own words. But I'm just not very quick when it comes to researching. And some people really have a knack for it. And Haley definitely does. She works very fast. She's very thorough. She cites all of her sources so that I can easily go down and see exactly where she pulled a fact or a piece of information. And it just makes everything run so much more smoothly with the show.
So we're starting to get some questions, which is great. If you do have a question, make sure you put a Q in front of it so that we know it's a Q. Before I get to a couple of those, though, I want to ask you this. Your show is called Moms and Mysteries. It wasn't always called that.
Yeah.
What was it called before, and why did you change it?
So it was called Moms and Murder. That was a random, when I thought of doing a podcast and thought of doing a true crime one, it just popped in my head when I talked to Mandy about doing that with me. And while it's a very quick name, when people see it there, it's automatically takes your attention. The problem is we don't want to be insensitive. And as time has gone on in true crime, the ethics around it, we're learning. And so we don't want to hurt somebody who's been through the most horrible thing in their entire life and be insensitive. We started working with families, and our researcher, Haley, actually is the one who said, if you did Moms and Mysteries, that still has the same sound to it, and it's alliteration and our names. And so it was a very easy decision to make that switch. A couple of years ago, people had to some degree, why are you changing it? They all thought there was like a huge story behind it. I guess we were getting sued, who knows? But none of that was true. It was truly just to be a better advocate for families. And some families that reach out to us, they have a missing person in their family. They don't want to assume that person's been murdered. So you're bringing up this really dark thing. So having Moms and Mysteries ended up being a really big decision for us, but a really great one.
This also lets you open up to true petty crimes,
absolutely,
shoplifting.
Yeah.
And, lewd
We've got you on our
public.
list next week. Yeah.
Fantastic. That's all I need with the probation and all. And it just real quick on the name change, I showed a lot of data about how the consumers react to brands, right? And some brands I know are, and I'm going to say this deliberately gun shy about advertising on true crime in a way with podcasts that they don't seem to be on TV.
Yeah.
Did that play a role in it? And what's your relationship been with brands?
I think there have been some brands for sure who are a little unsure about working with true crime in general. So we'll get some ad buys that say they just want to test the waters. They're going to try one thing and just kind of feel it out. But then I think when people realize true crime really is kind of a community, and it's actually a great place to advertise. You're reaching, as your research has shown, there's just a diverse group of people, but it's people that are very passionate about it. So when you do have an advertiser that is kind of unsure, we're not the joke say, and this person got murdered, and this week we're having this, meal box delivery service. That's not what we do. So I think if you're handling it with respect and kind of incorporating it naturally, I think in the episode in a way that doesn't feel disrespectful, it can be very successful.
All right. So I want to take some questions from everyone who's here. And thank you so much for the gift of your time and attention to be here with us today. Here's a question from James Buckland. Have either of you, and you can put a big X or wave this off if you want. Have either of you experienced a personal crime or offense?
Do you want to answer it, Mandy? I mean, I'm not saying you have one.
As an adult, no. When I was 17, I did steal some political signs out of my neighbor's yard, and they ended up calling the police, and they came to my door the next morning, and my parents were very upset because me and my friends went and just kid stuff. We just went and pulled signs out of people's yards and threw them in the lake. Not even maliciously, just because we were just kids. But that was about as close to committing a crime as I've ever come.
The question wasn't commit. It was like, have you been a part of a crime? So,
have you experienced? But wow.
Keep going.
No, and thankfully I have not. Well, I mean, other than just crimes of having my car broken into and things, I'm very fortunate to say that I have not been the victim of a serious crime.
Here's a question from Charlie Crimebuster. And Charlie, if you're not in true crime, it's sort of like someone named Bob Dentist not being into dental health. So I assume that you are into true crime. But Charlie Crimebuster asks, is there a significant reason why women prefer true crime versus men? And I would like you guys to answer that. I would like you both to kind of give a take on what is it?
I think that in media, we see often how women are often victims in attacks in all these different situations, domestic violence, tons of stuff. So I think that we have this weird, I'll speak for myself personally. I think I have this weird need to understand what's happened, understand and kind of think through situations. If anyone's an Enneagram person, I'm an Enneagram 6. So I worry and I think through everything. And so for me, it's like listening to a story and not victim blaming and saying, oh, they should have done this, but just wondering, all right, if I'm in that situation, what do I do? What are the red flags? Like, what can I look out for? And I think as women, we think about that. Going out in the world, you are thinking about that. I have to be much more observant than my husband is. He doesn't even know I am being observant, because he doesn't have to do that. And so I think just having that hyper awareness almost makes us more likely to want to consume it.
Yeah, I feel like I have pretty much the same response. I think that women are the higher consumers of true crime because women are more often the victims of true crime, and people like to listen to things that are relatable to them, especially when it comes to women who have already been the victim of a crime. It's really common for them to want to seek out other stories of other people who have been through this. What have they done to get through it? What are some things, does their life look like on the other side of something horrific happening to them? And then, like Melissa was saying, how do we prevent women from becoming victims of a crime? And I think that definitely plays probably the biggest role in why you see the gender kind of disparity there between the listeners, because I feel like it's just women are just generally more interested in it because we have more at stake, I guess you could say.
I would, to add on to what Mandy was saying, in October, we did a domestic violence awareness campaign, and we had so many emails from people who had left domestic violence situations. Their child had been in anything like that, just that you wouldn't even expect, who are listening to this, and to write to say, I wish I would have known these facts that we were sharing in the episodes. I wish I would have known this. We had one lady who very kindly said, some of the facts we mentioned 2 years ago was something that she really kept in her head when it was time to make the choice to leave her husband. And so I thought that was incredible that you're sharing, that kind of information, and that we've been able to do that. And women, I think, really, we try to look out for each other. And I think that that kind of goes with it as well.
Jeff asks, does true crime podcasting have a better audience with video or audio? And I can take a stab at that. But before I do, did either of you want to say anything more about video and kind of your thoughts about YouTube and what the potential role of video for you, but also for true crime might be?
Well, first, I would say please help us, because we don't know what we're doing with video. But it's something that we're really looking for in 2025. It's tough because we are talking about such serious things that, us just sitting around on a couch and laughing isn't probably going to be received super well. So we're still trying to figure it out. I feel like audio's been great for us, but I know that's something that we're going to be looking more into in the future.
Yeah, so we put out a report just a few weeks ago where we looked at the kind of self-reported percentages versus audio versus video that the podcast consumer listens to, and the almost half of podcast consumers say that they listen to more than 75% of their shows.
Yeah,
and the percentage who say the exact opposite, who say that they watch 75% of their podcasts, was only 14%. So there's a difference. There's a lot of people who will discover a podcast, and at least the people aspect of it is certainly growing in terms of video consumption. But then actual consumption still absolutely leans audio, even if that is through YouTube, which I know from a dozen studies is an audio platform for so many people.
Yeah.
Especially the mobile version of it. And it's, and again, we are really kind of talking about YouTube here. It's not necessarily being watched. But you bring up a really good point too. I think you don't want to be laughing and chuckling at inopportune moments doing a true crime podcast. So doing it live might be a little difficult, I guess.
Yeah, we've been asked to do live shows a few times, and that's like our biggest fear, is making a joke at the wrong time. Whereas I edit our show, so if we say something that might be, considered to be off color or off what we're trying to say, I'm very quick to take it out. And so we trust each other. I will never give editing fully over to someone else, because you don't want to appear insensitive. So going to video, I think for us would be hard. We can do it, but I think it's going to be a challenge.
Do you think the stakes are higher for you for a true crime podcast than they might be for a comedy or a current affairs or a celebrity interview podcast?
I absolutely do. I feel like people are way less tolerant of any mistakes that people in true crime make when it comes to just like being sensitive, and the perception that you are taking everybody's feelings into consideration whenever you're telling these stories and talking about people, like Melissa was saying earlier, who have experienced the worst thing in their life. And it is hard sometimes because we all know that different people get upset over different things. Not everyone is going to find, the same things offensive. There are some, people might find something offensive that other people don't think is that big of a deal. And like Melissa was saying, that's where it really is nice to be able to go back and have control of editing your own show, because there are times that we say things in the moment and don't even realize it. And then Melissa will text me while she's editing and be like, I just don't like the way this sounds. Like, do you mind if I take this part out? And I'm like, no, I agree. Like, that's not how I meant for it to sound. So I would rather not have it in there. But you can't really do that, when you're live. And so I think both of us are a little scared because we truly do not want to upset anyone or offend anybody. And especially if they've been the victim of a crime. So we, I feel like we have been doing this for a long time, and it's not like we're just constantly saying things that would get us,
I
people
realized
would be upset
after, I
about.
was like, what are they going to think
Right.
we're saying?
No, we're not really saying anything that bad, but it's always like I was saying, I do feel like there's less tolerance for it. And so I feel like we try to operate on like the no mistakes, kind of thing, instead of saying, oh, well, if we mess up, it's okay. I think both of us are kind of like, we cannot mess up. It is not okay.
Also, we should be held to a different, people should look at it different. It should be harder on true crime podcasters because of the nature of what you're doing. If you're doing a comedy podcast, whatever. But if we're talking about these serious things, we want to get things right, and we should be held to, a higher standard in that way.
So here's a question from Jen Moss. And Melissa, I'll ask you this.
Okay.
What are some specific ways that you sensitively incorporate branded or ad content into your storytelling?
So we really, I think, Mandy, remind me if this is not true. From the beginning, we have literally going into an ad break, say, we'll be right back after a word from this week's sponsors. We have a little bit of music that plays, so you're going into almost a different segment, and then the music plays back and we're back in. So we're able to really have it as part of our show without having to do that mailbox kind of thing, to kind of, make a joke and get into it. We're able to say, this is our episode, thank you to our sponsors, and here's more of our episode. And people have responded really positively to that.
I feel like also too, just being mindful of where you're even putting the ad breaks, because there's a lot of times even when I will be into a podcast and listen, very intently listening, and out of nowhere in like the middle of a very important part, they will just start going into an ad. And like, I of course don't mind listening to ads in podcasts. I understand that's how it works.
That's how we make money. Like, we have to listen
exactly.
to them.
but as a listener, myself, I do find that it's very annoying to have to break from the story at like an inopportune time, or a time that like really doesn't make sense to be even taking a break, particularly if you're talking about a tough part of the story or part of the crime. The last thing you want to do is interrupt that with a break. So I feel like just really being mindful about choosing where you're putting the ad, the breaks for the ads, and making sure that, what you just said right before you took the ad break isn't insensitive to the ad that you're about to go into, kind of thing.
That is true. Yes.
Just a follow-up from me on this. Are there any advertisers that you have or would turn down?
Yes. Libsyn's been really great with us about that. So when we've had advertisers that just don't feel like a good fit, we're able to say, I don't know about that. And honestly, it happens probably once a week that something comes through that just doesn't feel right for us. And Libsyn's been amazing about that. There's just stuff that doesn't make sense. Like, why? I'm not saying Libsyn's done this. This is just an example. Crypto does not make sense for us two knuckleheads to try and get people involved in, nor do I want to be involved in crypto unless I'm cashing out a coin, but I don't have one. I'm wishing now that somebody would have sold me on crypto. But, that's not going to make sense to us. We did get one for like a undergarments for children, which sounds really gross, but I know the company and it wasn't gross, but we just, as moms, I was like, I don't want to talk about my kids' underwear. I'm not doing that. So it's been, it's great that Libsyn gives us this opportunity to say no to things, and they don't push us on it. And it's exciting when we get stuff 99% of the time that's a great match for us.
So I'm gonna throw a technical question here from Robert Riggs. Hey, Robert, what editing software does Melissa use?
So my husband has a background in audio engineering, so he definitely helped us in the beginning kind of figure out what to do. So currently I take our audio, I work on the initial sound in Adobe Audition, and then I export it to Descript. I love Descript. If you're not using Descript, you're really messing with yourself. It's basically like a text document. So I can go through and I can see where Mandy and I always say edit when we're recording. So we know to listen for the edit and repeat it, which I'm surprised, Mandy, you and I haven't done that on this call. We do it in real life now. But, one of us will say da, 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 edit, and then repeat it. And I can see where it says edit, and I can go ahead and know to look out for it and delete that section. Then I export it back to Adobe Audition. And I think I answered that question really lengthy, but that's kind of my way of doing it.
Yeah, I do my own, and I just do a big clap in front of the mic, and I can see the waveform, and that's typically how I do it. So
it's very smart, but you got to get on the
I clap a lot when I'm,
Yeah.
I want to do a follow-up sound question, and then I want to go back to something on advertising. Here's a question. I'm curious about your opinion on sound design. This is a really good question. I've hired someone to add music and sound effects. It seems that the more theater of the mind that you can add, the more the podcast benefits. Any thoughts? What's the role of theater of the mind in what you do?
I like that phrase. Mandy, I remember early on, we kind of tossed around the idea of adding more, suspenseful music and stuff throughout. But because our show is more conversational, it would sound insane if we did that. And it would be really difficult. So we would kind of have to either change the format of our show or do the sound. But a lot of shows do it and do it so effortlessly that it's such an important part of their episodes that I don't know what I would do without hearing it, Like they just do it so well, so flawlessly that it doesn't feel like you're listening to a car crash and then, a key in the door. It just all is just this big worldview of being able to take it in with other senses. I love it.
So you don't have a soundboard that just has the Wilhelm scream on it over and over?
No, sorry, not yet.
Darn it. It seems like it would be an easy solution.
Yeah.
I want to back up. I missed this question about brands, and I want to catch it. Regarding advertisers, how have you been able to integrate the true crime nature of your show with brands, which seems like it could be fun, but also quite challenging? Any integrations there to talk about?
I think we might have answered something similar a few minutes ago, or maybe this one. For true crime, I think it's going to be difficult unless you're doing there are the petty crime stories. I think those would be really fun to incorporate. I have another podcast I host with Rebecca Sebastian, who I saw in the chat a minute ago, Criminality. And we're able to have more, it is true crime. It's reality TV and true crime. So they're just like idiots doing stuff. So it's much more easy to, put in a fun little way of bringing up a story from that within our ad. Whereas the ones Mandy and I do, it's really all from personal experience, which the other ones are as well. But personal experience seems to be what our listeners gravitate towards. And it really has worked.
Excellent. Well, I think we're at time, and we have gone through all the questions that I think we had. I need to, as I said, I need to fix a typo.
You got 2 minutes.
Then I'll talk slowly. But in this last 2 minutes, I do want to thank you both. It's been marvelous to hear your perspective from a real grown-up professional true crime podcast. It's the amount of research and work that goes into it is just I can't even imagine doing that because I'm a slacker. So I'm much respect to you both, and really appreciate your perspective going through the data, because sometimes you work on this stuff and you're screaming into the void. And it was really cool to see what resonated and also where your show differs. So Melissa and Mandy, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And thanks for everyone that attended.
And I want to thank especially Libsyn for being a partner of Sounds Profitable, but also being a sponsor of our entire research program. It's the only way that we can continue to provide these insights to everybody free, without any constraints whatsoever, to try to continue to grow the space. So thank you very much, Libsyn. And on behalf of Sounds Profitable, you will be able to find the research on the Sounds Profitable /research page very, very soon, as I fix that darn typo. But on behalf of my partner, Brian, and Gavin at Sounds Profitable as well, thank you very much for the gift of your time and attention, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.